Hello, everyone. My name is Tyler Stegall, and I did my case analysis over a crisis that had just struck the NCAA um, last March, right at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. This crisis kind of still withers today, as there are some questions and concerns that sort of haven't been answered yet from the NCAA. So, here we'll get into it. So here's my crisis description. Um, according to Combs, in the stages of crisis management, there's three stages. There's a three. It's the street stage framework articulated by Combs from the text, and so um, here's just a little overview of the crisis itself. So the NCAA winter sports athletes were very negatively impacted by this pandemic. The NCAA is still trying to find solution to the crisis, but for the 2019-2020 winter sports student athletes, there is really no solution. These winter sports athletes were robbed of their 2020 postseason championships due to the start of the coronavirus and were not granted another year of competition eligibility to make up for it. Spring sports athletes were indeed granted another year of eligibility due to the cancellation of the entirety of their season. In response to the crisis, the NCAA just came out and said they would grant all athletes an extra year of eligibility. So that was a little overview of the crisis itself. With the winter sports season still not here, we are still hearing more and more about what is yet to come for this year's winter sports athletes. So there are many that are still being affected by this crisis. So in the first three-stage framework of by Combs in the text, Combs goes over pre-crisis, which is the first stage. Pre-crisis involves detection of the crisis, prevention of the crisis, and preparation from the crisis. So pre-crisis, the NCAA committee would have a meeting about the eligibility of the winter sports athletes, as spring sports extra year of eligibility was already approved. Many of the winter sports athletes were expecting to also be handed another year of eligibility from the NCAA because of the news that was released about spring sports. The NCAA ended up denying the grant of another year of eligibility to winter sports athletes. This really left the winter sports athletes and coaches upset, which would be the beginning to the crisis for the NCAA. So, as you can see, when we're talking about signal detection from the text, they could kind of detect that the COVID-19 pandemic was probably going to be a signal from the crisis itself when we're talking about pre-crisis. So going into the next slide here, we have the crisis event, and what the crisis event includes is recognizing the crisis and containing the crisis. So the NCAA knew that this would cause issues within their athletes, coaches, and schools of the entire organization. NCAA just came out with a statement saying that they will indeed provide an extra year of eligibility for winter sports athletes. The NCAA's council voted Wednesday to grant all winter sports athletes an extra year of eligibility at their current school, no matter how many games their teams play in the coronavirus abbreviated season, no matter how many minutes they play in them, no matter whether they're freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior. This is very important and crucial for the NCAA, as they kept their athletes and members of the organization satisfied with how they handled the crisis. So, when, just like I said, in the process of crisis event, recognize the crisis, At the start of the crisis, an organization's leader may deny that a problem exists. Recognizing a crisis at the outset can help prevent the problem of the overwhelming organization. The NCAA knew that this was going to cause issues within their athletes, coaches, and schools of the organization. So that's kind of how they're recognizing the crisis. And then to contain the crisis, the NCAA Council voted to grant all the winter sports athletes an extra year of eligibility to their current school, no matter how many games their teams play in the season that could be interrupted by the coronavirus. So going into the finishing up the second stage of the three-stage framework by Combs. Going into the third stage, we have post-crisis. The post-crisis is articulated by Combs is basically an analysis of the crisis itself and what they've really learned from the crisis and what they did to kind of satisfy their stakeholders and their members of the organization. The analysis needs to ensure that stakeholders are left with a positive impression of the crisis management efforts for the organization. Finally, there should be a mechanism to ensure that the crisis is truly over. So I guess when we're talking about how this crisis is still continuing, I guess for the winter sports athletes who lost their 2019-2020 postseason championship, there's not much you can do to give that back besides grant them another year. So I guess you could say that this is the end of that crisis. And then whatever lies ahead of us in the future will be another crisis that the NCAA has to put up with. So in the post-crisis process, the NCAA has learned a lot throughout this crisis. With expressed emotions from athletes, coaches, and schools of the NCAA on social media outlets, the NCAA recognized how wrong they were by not granting these athletes another year of eligibility. After realizing how wrong they were, they decided to grant all the winter sports athletes an extra year of eligibility. This helped with satisfying the members of their organizations, such as coaches, athletes, and schools that are part of the NCAA. So as you can see, these athletes were left. The athletes, coaches, and schools who were all affected by this, the loss of the winter sports season in 2019 and 2020. They are able to kind of stay level-headed now that their athletes are being granted another year, which is basically a redo year for that lost season. So that's kind of how, in conclusion, that's kind of how the NCAA was able to work through this crisis, and using the three-stage framework from Combs, from the text that we have been going over. That includes pre-crisis, containing a crisis event, and post-crisis. That's kind of the process of how the NCAA was able to handle this crisis as a whole, and now students will be granted another year of eligibility. And with the 2021 season coming up, just here in a short couple weeks, we'll see what the future holds for athletics. So, thank you.